Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE's second conversation in 2025. It's a great privilege to have Adrian Wooldridge with us today, one of the world's leading journalists, a prolific author and political commentator. He is currently the global business columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, and before that, he worked for The Economist for 32 years, writing successively the Lexington, Schumpeter and Bagehot columns, and serving as Washington correspondent and then Washington bureau chief in 2000 to 2010. He's the author or co-author of some 11 books, including most recently, How Meritocracy Made the Modern World, The Global Race to Reinvent the State. Other books include a wonderful book on the company, short and very insightful, and a book on management firms a long time ago with a wonderful title of The Witch Doctors. What I really like about Adrian is that he is a journalist who likes to get out and see things for himself, whether it's going from state to state and city to city in the United States, to provide a far more nuanced picture of that very big country, or traipsing the streets of North Delhi with me to go and see examples of the many thousands of private schools for the poor. Adrian, it's great to have you in South Africa again, albeit virtually. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind, very flattering, and partially true introduction.
Well, let's jump in because there's a lot I want to talk to you about. The famous American Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once warned in the late 1960s that the stability of democratic government required making a careful distinction between what government can do and what it cannot do. You have argued that Western governments have overreached with increasingly bad consequences. Why do you say this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Daniel Patrick Moynihan is an extremely interesting figure to think about at the moment because he was a radical centrist. He was a Democrat, but he was an extremely sensible Democrat who worried about the Democratic Party moving too far to the left, whilst also vigorously combating the Republican Party. So he represents a sort of radical centrism that is being squeezed out of existence more recently. So he was a great figure and a figure we should revisit, I think, as often as we can. And what he was basically saying there is that the state is a marvelous thing. It can help the poor, it can boost opportunities, it can preserve order and peace, but it can also go over the top. It can promise too much. And if you promise too much, you create a revolution of rising expectations, you create frustration amongst the electorate, and ultimately you prepare the way for your gravediggers, for your critics. And that's exactly what has happened. We've moved from promising a state that can keep the streets clean, keep law and order, to one that can provide economic opportunity, to one that can provide social justice, however that is defined, and that's a very mobile goal. And the result of that is that people all around the world feel frustrated with the state. They take it out on the state, and the people who run the state, they say, you've promised us things that you haven't delivered, and the state is not really very good, so let's smash it. Let's get rid of it, or let's reorder it radically. And so this revolution of rising expectations created by the government and the people who populated the government has created a backlash, which is sweeping around the world now and is extremely dangerous.
So how did we, I know you've thought a lot about this, how did we get to the Western state? What do you think the state is actually for? What should it limit itself to doing?
Well, the Western states, which is very much the status that has spread all around the world, in the 20th century, starts off really, I think, in the 16th and 17th centuries with Thomas Hobbes, who says that what the state is for is providing security, stopping, if life is in the state of nature is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, and that the way we can stop people from giving way to their natural aggressiveness is by handing all power to the state, and the state becoming this sort of leviathan, the term that he uses, to impose law and order. And that's the fundamental, that's the basic role of the state. Then you get layers on top of that. In the mid-19th century, John Stuart Mill, who's the next person to come along with a really comprehensive view of the state, a liberal view of the state, says, well, the state is basically about providing freedom and the conditions for freedom. The conditions for freedom are law and order. They're also a just and efficient state. But apart from that, we shouldn't try to do too much. The state should, he talks about the night watchman state, the state restricting what it does in order to maximize freedom. So with Hobbes, you're maximizing security. With Mill, you're maximizing freedom. Then in the early 20th century, you get a more complicated notion of what the state is about. People begin to say, well, what is freedom for the child of a chimney sweep who has to go up a chimney at the age of 10? Or for somebody who can't afford to feed themselves or house themselves or clothe themselves. So that they then add a new notion of freedom, which is the freedom to participate in civilized life, which requires a minimum of welfare provisions. That's I talk about Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who were sort of big socialists. They were really the inventors of the British welfare state. So that's a new notion, a more nuanced notion of freedom, which is freedom to participate in civilized life with the state taking responsibility for healthcare, education, pensions, and things like that. Then that conception of the state really keeps expanding and expanding and expanding until you get another correction coming in with the so-called neoconservatives, people like, or the neoliberals, I should call them, people like Hayek and Friedman, who say, well, we need a bit more John Stuart Mill, a bit more 19th century liberalism, because the state has got so big that in providing the freedoms of education and pensions, the rest of it, it's crushing too many other freedoms. So I really think that, you know, Hobbes and security, Mill and freedom, and the Webbs and a minimum set of welfare benefits. Those are the three parameters. And since then, we've been arguing about the boundaries of the state. Now, more recently, and I didn't talk about this in my book at all on the Fourth Revolution, but it's a more recent thing. There's a sort of idea that the state should also engage in identity issues. It should celebrate your identity in some sense. So if you're on the left, it should celebrate your identity, whether it's a gender identity or a sexual identity or a race identity, or if you're on the right, it should celebrate your national identity. So the new wave of nationalism is centers much more about identity issues, and that is, of course, much more divisive, because whereas, you know, welfare states are designed, and security states are designed to bring the nation together, identity questions always raise issues about, you know, who we are, not just what is the state for, but who are the we who are being catered for.
Very interesting. You once said that, rather elegantly, that many governments and politicians are essentially robbing future generations to stuff our own faces.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I mean, and I take personal responsibility for this in some ways as a member of the baby boom generation, because the baby boom generation, which really came to fruition in the 1960s and 70s, has been indulging itself. It's been grabbing a lot of free stuff and consuming a lot of free stuff, particularly when it comes to entitlements, pensions, and the rest of it, at the expense of future generations. So, you know, in most countries, certainly the United States and Britain, we have basically a a bankrupt pension or entitlement system because we've been paying ourselves more than we've been earning. We've also been plundering the planet in terms of the environment. We've been using stuff excessively, we've been wasting stuff, we've been polluting stuff. So I think we have been indulging our short-term whims and needs at the expense of future generations.
Now, you've thought a lot about corruption and cronyism,
Yes.
and you have at different times argued that we should enrich the civil service and impoverish politicians. And yet you've also said that many civil servants are more interested in prosperity for themselves than for the people. How do you see those issues?
Yeah, it's a very difficult dialectic between, on the one hand, the civil service and the permanent state, and on the other hand, democracy, getting the balance between the two right. I think it's quite important that you don't have a reign of populists, super democracy in which everything is voted for. There are certain things that need to be subcontracted to officials in order to prevent this problem which I've just been talking about, which is current generations over-consuming at the expense of future generations. So I think it's quite important to have an independent banking system. It used to be the case that most banks were directly under the control of democratically elected politicians. And the result of that was, inflationary cycles, because politicians like to buy votes. So I think that's important. I think it's quite important for pension systems to be as independent from the government as possible, so the government isn't tempted to plunder those pension systems or to use them to create cheap investments in their own industries and things like that. So there are certain bits of the state that need to be independent, and the legal system is a very important thing that needs to be guarded from too much democratic interference. However, I'm now going to say however, and that this leads me to some of what you've picked out, which is a certain intellectual contradiction in what I'm saying, which is that if the technocratic elite becomes too divorced from the people and democratic accountability, it can become self-indulgent, it can become blind to popular worries and popular concerns, and it can become sort of illegitimate in that sense. It can overreach. Just as you can have an overreach of democracy, you can also have an overreach of the permanent state. And one of the things that's driven populism is fury with the overreach of the permanent state. I think the permanent states in Europe, for example, let me give you an example of overreach, which it says that you should have freedom of movement within Europe for all people. So national governments don't have control over who is in their population. Once you're a European citizen, you can move wherever you want. That's a big infringement on democratic freedom, on the traditional notion that people could vote to determine who should be part of their communities. At the same time, you've had a very, very large migration into Europe, particularly in 2016, when Merkel said, we can do it, allow 1 million plus people in. So you had a time when 1 million people came into Europe, and once they were in Europe, and they're European citizens, they could move wherever they want. A lot of them came to Britain. So that means that the British essentially had no control over this decision that was made by Merkel and then underwritten by European law. That created a huge backlash. Brexit was one of the results of that backlash. And I would say that that backlash is a product of technocratic overreach. And I think we're seeing more and more examples of that within the legal system. I think it's absolutely vital that the legal system should be protected from democratic interference, that you should have independent judicial legal institutions. But part of that vitality is that lawyers shouldn't overreach. They should exercise a sort of restraint on themselves. And I think increasingly we're getting lawyers making laws on very, very sensitive issues, which arouses a lot of hostility and opposition, particularly UN international law, particularly laws concerning with the movements of large numbers of people, and that drives populism. And that's, you have a very malign dialectic between overreaching technocratic elites and angry populists who say, get rid of the whole system of checks and balances and constraints. Part of what we need to do in the future is to tame the populists, but an important part of taming the populists is to persuade technocratic elites not to overreach, to exercise a sort of self-discipline. And these people tend to be self-confident, they tend to be arrogant, they tend to be rather cloistered from society, they tend to be quite well paid, so they don't see the downside of a lot of the things that they're doing, and they tend to take the populists as a challenge to be defeated rather than as a reality to be dealt with and accommodated.
A lot of issues in that.
Yeah, indeed, yes.
Yeah. So let me ask about one issue, which is, can we reform the state?
Yeah.
Is change possible? Tell us about Sweden and Singapore and how you see reform of the state.
The very short answer to the question, and I'm conscious I'm giving you very long answers in the past. I'll give you a short answer. The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is yes, but there have been very good and brave examples of reform of the state. Singapore is, the classic example of this. Singapore was an exceptionally poor country. It was part of the British Empire. It was essentially a low-cost manufacturing sector for the British Empire and for the Far East. It then became, under Lee Kuan Yew, one of the world's best run, best educated societies. And Lee Kuan Yew built a fantastic state mechanism which worked really well with the private sector in order to leverage the system ever further up the sort of value chain. So it moves up in terms of education qualifications, provides very good education, obviously, very good healthcare, very good welfare, and does so on a long-term sustainable basis. So their pension system is very safe. So they are people that have better education than the British, better healthcare than the British, higher standard of living than the British. And that's all been done on the basis of a very far-seeing autocrat in the form of Lee Kuan Yew, but also investment in the state system. He wasn't a libertarian who said, let's get rid of the state and then we'll get prosperity. He was somebody who said that the state is something that's vital to modernization. The state isn't just about providing welfare, helping people who need help. It's about driving modernization. And you've had significant examples of people copying that. I think Rwanda, Kagame, to some extent, has done that. In Dubai and the Emirates, they're doing very similar things, which is a sort of top-down technocratic modernization model, which could work in some countries. And I think it's sometimes doesn't work, but it's certainly a significant model. Now, Sweden is a different sort of thing, but is another interesting example of the reform of the state. Sweden became the world's most generous welfare state. It became so generous that you didn't really need to work, and that if you did work, your taxation level became so high that you were giving away almost all your income to the state. And there were really no incentives, and the state was just kept taking a bigger and bigger chunk of income. And in the mid 1990s, this sort of hit the buffers in terms of what was practical, but also what was endurable in terms of providing people with a decent living. And so the state reformed itself. And it reformed itself in very radical and interesting ways. You had a privatization of the pension system, quasi-privatization of the pension system, so you bring in some private money. You had radical reforms of the education system, so you introduce school vouchers, you introduce independent schools that can take money from the state. You do exactly the same in the hospital system, so you have lots of private hospitals with using state money. Something much more radical than anything that was ever done in the United States or Britain, but yet was being done under the auspices of this rather centrist country, and the result was very good. That you had public spending under control, the pension system balanced, a broad consensus for these reforms, and a restabilizing of the welfare state. Now, since then, Sweden has had very, very serious problems with the immigration, and again, it's going around dealing with those serious problems with immigration in a very sensible and sort of well thought out manner, having really overindulged itself. So Sweden is an example of how you can, there are lots of people who would argue that the state, once it gets to a certain size, will just keep on growing, and it will sort of overburden society, and that the only way you can deal with that is to have a sort of revolution. And Sweden is an example of a country that reached a certain level and then collectively said, we can't go on like this, we need to reform, and in a very peaceful, centrist, considered way, pulled back from that. You're getting the same thing happening with immigration, that they've reached a point now. 20% of Swedes are now born outside of Sweden. It's got a very, very high level of immigration. It's also got a very, very high level of crime. Sweden has the highest level of shootings in Europe. It has a lot of suburbs that are really out of control, without any sort of system of law, which is not what you expect. You expect Sweden as a peaceful, sensible country, but it admitted a huge number of immigrants in a very short period of time, didn't integrate them properly with the labor market, and got a problem with gangs and gun violence and hand grenades and all sorts of things. It's now approaching those problems again in a very sort of centrist, consensus-based way, and dealing with them methodically. So that is a country that's been very good at reforming itself, and reforming itself in a sort of collective manner. Britain also reformed itself under Mrs. Thatcher with much more antagonism and much more internal conflict, but it did introduce a lot of very radical, far-reaching reforms in a short period of time.
Well, I hope to come back to migration in Europe a bit later on. Let's carry on with this theme. So you said that we're living through an age of state capitalism. And you've written a lot on this topic in the past. What are the strengths and weaknesses of state capitalism as you see it?
It's very easy to think that the world sort of went through a free market revolution, and that private companies, CEOs, private companies are the default form. CEOs are the sort of the kings of the world. I don't really think that ever happened. I think there was always much more state capitalism around the world than people were willing to give it credit for. That is, big companies run in some way by government. What you did get was the emergence of a new form of state capitalism. Instead of direct control by bureaucrats, you had indirect control by people who acted as though they were private sector actors, in the sense that they were trained in business schools, they had a business outlook, they mixed with other business people around the world, but were acting at arm's length on behalf of the state. The biggest example of this, of course, is China, where you have some of the world's biggest and most successful companies, but many, many, many of those companies are owned by the state through the mechanism of the stock market. So the state will there'll be private companies, but the state is the golden shareholder in those companies. So many of the world's biggest oil companies are really state companies. Most of the biggest companies in China are, and an increasing number of the biggest companies in China are really state companies. If you look at Singapore or Dubai, or the examples of countries with sort of authoritarian modernization, which I talked of earlier, you have very powerful state elements. So this notion that we went through a period of neoliberalism misses a very important nuance. And so I think there are, we have in the world the classic example of public companies, i.e. private companies owned by dispersed shareholders, run by independent managers and things like that. But you also have two other categories of companies which are incredibly important. One is state capitalist companies, i.e. companies whereby the majority or the controlling majority of shares are owned by the state, indirectly, probably through funds of various sorts, and family companies, that is, companies that are owned by very powerful families, business families. And family companies and state companies, state-owned companies, are the two sort of elements of capitalism that most people who write about capitalism and think about capitalism don't talk about anywhere near enough. And certainly, you know, when we look at the markets, we're looking at publicly listed companies rather than these other more nuanced sorts of companies.
You've gone on to say that the public sector and the private sector are fundamentally different. In what ways? What matters about that?
Yeah, I mean, they're different in the sense that they're accountable to different people or different groups of people. The public sector is accountable to the public, and the private sector ultimately is accountable to its shareholders, its owners, people who own things. And that creates a very different set of dynamics and very different set of incentives. I mean, the incentives in the public sector are, well, of course, you know, empire building goes on in the public sector, that's true, but ultimately it's justified by the extent to which it serves the public. In the there's lots of pretense in the private sector. They care about stakeholders and all of this sort of pattern of stuff and responsibility. But ultimately, they are accountable to their shareholders, who are their owners and who own the companies and demand some sort of return for their capital, which they're risking by investing in those companies. So it's important not to confuse these things. Now, what I talked about earlier, the state-owned company, these are very peculiar sort of things. They're sort of a bit of one and a bit of the other. But what makes them better than the old socialist regimes is that they have to produce a return for their owners. Their owners happen to be the people through the state, but they're nevertheless subjected to a sort of market discipline by that. They're trying to be the best of both worlds. And although they're probably not on average as efficient as purely private companies, they've done an amazing job in driving modernization in China, many of them.
And you're saying that's because they're listed on the stock exchange?
Well, by being listed on the stock exchange, they have a sort of accountability to owners, theoretical owners, which happen to be the state, but also it means that the sort of people who run them think in terms of business. They think in terms of improving their shareholder values. They think in terms of, and they socialize and encounter other business people, people. Their peer group is other business people. And they have been incredibly good in China. One of the very many things that the Chinese have done, which was very sensible, was to make sure these state-owned companies were global. So they're competing with other companies. They were going global, and they were competing with other global businesses. Yeah. So they compare themselves not with the department of paper clips. They compare themselves with Esso or Shell or whatever.
Right. Which is very different from a sort of national state-owned company.
Yeah, of the old sort.
Yeah,
the old sort. Yeah. So the question is, how is ownership exercised? Is it exercised by the stock market or via a bureaucrat telling them what to do? And who their comparators are, what their business they think they're in. If they're a classic state-owned nationalized industry, they think their business is getting the approval of politicians. If they're a sort of state-owned enterprise listed on a market, they think that their business is also competing with other businesses.
Which one's more prone to crony capitalism, in your view, or is it too hard to generalize?
It's a very good and very interesting question. I mean, the simplest answer would be that a national company, a nationalized company, would be very, very prone to cronyism. That's certainly true. but I'm not sure that we've entirely escaped from the problem of cronyism in the capitalist world, And if you look at the United States, for example, the amount of circulation between the public sector and the private sector, if you let's give a name of Goldman Sachs is often nicknamed Government Sachs because so many people go from the government to Goldman Sachs and from Goldman Sachs to the government. And if you look at cronyism, one of the biggest bits of cronyism in the last few decades has been the bailout of the banks after 2008, where billions and billions, trillions was spent on companies to prevent them from going bankrupt. So there's quite a lot of cronyism under the current version of free markets, particularly if you have organizations like banks that are too networked, too big, and too integral to the future of the economy to fail. You can't let them fail, so they can basically they can basically threaten us. I mean, what's the word? Bribe us into supporting them. Bully us.
Let's move a bit. I was intrigued recently where you wrote a column on why you prefer the words emerging markets to the increasingly popular phrase, the global south. Explain what you're thinking here.
Well, the least good argument for my position, but one which I do feel about the global south, is much of the global south isn't in the south, it's in the north. It's a misnomer. India, China, they're not in the southern hemisphere. So it doesn't really get you anywhere geographically, but more importantly, I think it's a way of thinking about the world which is profoundly unhelpful, because it's basically about political lobbying. If you talk about the global south, you're talking about a chunk of the world which has been wronged in the past by imperialism and whose future depends on righting that wrong through complaining, through agitating, and through getting the rich world to give back some of its terrible ill-gotten gains. If you talk about emerging markets, you're talking about getting richer through market activity. And you're talking about those countries taking control of their own destiny, putting in place free markets, and through the process of trade, generating more wealth and moving up the value chain. One is about redistribution and resentment. Some of that resentment is justified. We did have an imperialist system, and that's very bad. But it doesn't ultimately get you to sustain growth, even if we redistribute all the gains that Britain got from South Africa, let's say. That doesn't get you to sustain growth. The only thing that gets you to sustain growth is having a productive economy that becomes more productive over time. And the only way you do that is through emerging markets. Now, this notion of the global south, I'm not just indulging in conspiracy thinking here. The notion of the global south is something that is heavily pushed by the Russians and heavily pushed by the Chinese as part of a way of saying, come and join us. We're on the side of the ordinary people against the evil West, the evil capitalist world. It's a way of rejigging the old socialist arguments that powerful countries like the old Soviet Union and China need to stand up to the bullying, greedy, exploitative West in order to redistribute wealth through the exercise of power. The only way to produce sustained prosperity is through the exercise of productivity, innovation, markets, growth. You can have forced redistribution of wealth if you want. You can get China to do that or Russia to do it, but it will not produce sustained growth. So it's a politicization. It's a revival of the old Marxist arguments. And people like Lavrov, is pretty open about what he's doing when he talks about the global majority. It means the global majority must gang up on the global minority.
Minister.
Sorry?
Yeah. The Russian, Lavrov, Russian
foreign minister. He talks about this a lot, and the Chinese talk about this a great deal, and they're resuscitating Marxist arguments. It's essentially Marxist arguments. As I say, they're saying the solution to our problems, or your problems, everybody's problems, is politics, because it's politics that will redistribute wealth. That's wrong. The solution to the problem of poverty is growth, and the way to get growth is improvements in productivity through innovation and through markets. So let's not talk about the global south. Let's talk about emerging markets. And this is something, whenever I go to conferences, people will always just use this phrase global south without really thinking through what it means. And one of the things that the left has been very good at is capturing arguments and introducing phrases which seem to be innocent, but in fact have very profound implications for the way the world works, and very bad implications for the way the world works. So, and as I say, it's geographically nonsense anyway.
Right. Great. Thank you. Very interesting. I'm going to turn now to your most recent book very quickly.
Yes.
So you wrote this really important book about meritocracy.
Yes.
What is the core insight about talent, about the modern world and merit that the essence of this, of your
the essence of the book is that the revolution that is modernity is a revolution that's been created by treating individuals as individuals rather than as members of collectivities. And the way we got from the feudal world, the old-fashioned world, to the modern world was to get from judging people as members of castes or classes or tribes to judging them as individuals with their own individual identities and talents. It used to be the case that when you were saying, how can we allocate scarce resources like educational opportunities or jobs, we used to do it by who your father was, or by buying and selling jobs, which was done in quite a lot of activities, or by patronage. You were a powerful person, you controlled this job, you give it to somebody else. And we had a succession of revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the sort of liberal revolution in Britain in the 19th century. It said, no, that's not the way to do it. If you're allocating scarce resources, you look at people's individual qualities, their individual talents, their ability to do that job well, and you give it on that basis. Groups out, individual assessments in. And I think this is one of the keys to sustained growth. One of the things that took the world from a world in which you essentially had a flat economy in which everybody's squabbling about a limited number of resources to a world with sustained growth is meritocracy. And if you look at all sorts of things, if you look at companies, meritocratic companies outperform non-meritocratic companies. If you look at countries, meritocratic countries outperform non-meritocratic countries. If you look at flows of migration, you have migration from patronage-based countries to merit-based countries. And to give you one example of that, let's say from Greece. Greece is a country which has had a very powerful system of family patronage, of control, and it's had massive outflows of people to more open countries like the United States and Britain. So I regard meritocracy as a way of giving resources justly on the basis of individual abilities rather than of class prejudice. But I also think it's a way of creating growth of productivity improvements. So I think it's the key to the modern world. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which meritocracy can go wrong, and all sorts of ways in which my simple formula needs to be made more nuanced to take into account differences of background and things like that. But fundamentally, the modern world is about merit, not patronage and inheritance.
Great, very well summarized. There's people pushing against your kind of view, against meritocracy. What are the key arguments and what alternatives are there? What are they putting?
The key arguments are some of them good and some of them very bad. The good argument is that people who come from richer backgrounds are themselves going to do well in a system of educational resources and privilege. So that the argument would be that through meritocracy, you're simply labeling class privilege in a new way. So the people with good educations will always do better in that. I don't think that's necessarily true in the long term, because if you look, let's say, at British history, once you had universal schooling and increasingly universal higher education, what you got was an enormous amount of upward social mobility from the working classes, or an important category here, females. You know, females used to be excluded from all of these opportunities. Now 60% of people going to universities in most advanced countries are women. So that's an example of meritocracy working. The poor arguments against meritocracy is that it just creates competition and elbows people pushing to get ahead and things like that. Well, I think that's a poor argument, because that's the case in any system. If you have a system of patronage, you'll just have people pushing to get to talk to the big man or the big woman who can allocate jobs. You'll always, when people are in competition resources, you'll get competition. The point is to make that competition as fair as possible. Now, something very interesting has happened in the United States, which is that under Joe Biden, you had a sort of what is called a woke revolution, with identity politics becoming incredibly important. So your gender, your race, your ethnicity became very important, and a lot of revolts against the notion of merit. Merit is then replaced by a notion that you should have certain privileges and rights because of who you are ethnically or biologically. And so meritocracy was weakened from an attack by the left. Now you're getting Trump coming in and saying, let's go for pure merit, let's get rid of all this affirmative action stuff, which is equally bad, because that is getting rid of all the systems which were put in place to take into account the fact that some people have lots of opportunities. Donald Trump Jr., for example, lots of opportunities. Other people don't have any. And what I would argue for is a middle ground between the getting rid of, you know, all of this affirmative action or obsessive group categorization, which says we need merit to be the system, but in order to have a proper meritocratic system, you have to have, you know, a certain amount of interference, a certain amount of affirmative action. You need to make sure that everybody has reasonable equal opportunities, and to get equal opportunities, you have to take into account the fact that some people have much poorer backgrounds than others. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to have not just a celebration of the status quo, and not just a system of distributing rewards on the basis of proportionality in the population, but a system of really active meritocracy that's actively searching for talents in every group in the population, not in order to create a statistical parity, but just because you need to find it. And sometimes it's harder to find it in some groups than others, because they've had a different history.
Well, this everybody's going to be a sort of Cook's tour of Adrian's thinking, because I now want to move, before we have to close, to some other things he thinks a lot about. So in 2 recent columns, you started engaging with capitalism and President Trump. You argue that the way in which the president is operating at the moment is undermining capitalism.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
I think that capitalism is a system that depends on having rules and having neutrality as much as possible. And it's precisely because capitalism is about sort of harnessing greed, very basic human emotions, that it needs to be constrained by a system of rules that prevent self-dealing, that prevent political corruption and cronyism, and that prevent favoritism. I think that we tried to do that under the formula which is called neoliberalism, which has got a bad name in certain quarters, but was an attempt to have a rule-based system. And that Trump is intervening with that in various and dangerous ways by abusing the power of the state, for example. not just by imposing tariffs, which I don't particularly agree with, but by imposing tariffs in a way that's unstable. He keeps putting tariffs on and taking them off and bullying them. So he's creating a very unstable environment. He's also tearing up a lot of the most important rules that make capitalism, that save capitalism from itself. And one of those, let's take the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which the Americans have got, which is a very vigorous act, which essentially means that American companies cannot bribe anywhere in the world. And if they do, they face very, very severe consequences. That was an extremely good act. It's an act which has spread good practices right around the world. It's good for the world. It's also good for those companies because they have, if you try and bribe them, they can say, no, we can't do that. We'll be put in prison, and that protects it. Getting rid of that is the opposite. You know, it's the opposite of Gresham's law. It's dragging us down to the worst possible level of conduct. He's doing similar things with removing legislation about anonymous beneficial owners of corporations. What you're having in the United States is a lot of, particularly in the real estate sector, is a lot of anonymous corporations owning real estate essentially, but also other forms of business. And most of those people who want to do that, who want to remain anonymous while owning a block of flats in Miami, let's say, are not doing it for good reasons. They're doing it for bad reasons. So all the things that we believe in, regular, predictable rules, transparency, anti-corruption legislation, are being weakened by this administration. Interestingly, one of the areas that it's not weakened is anti-monopoly legislation. And they've preserved a very sort of vigorous approach to mergers, acquisitions, and potential monopolies, which the Biden administration put in place, which one would have thought is a good thing, but I wonder if it's a cudgel which Trump wants to use to bully the tech sector into supporting him more, or to generally go after his enemies. We have an extreme politicization of the economy under Trump, and that's not a good thing. But he would never claim to be a liberal. He's not a liberal.
Mm. So, Adrian, you making that argument, you then went on to talk about CEOs in America, and that, in your view, many of them supported Trump, backed him for president, but it's time for them to find their missing backbones, in your words. What exactly do you want them to do? And how hopeful are you that they will find their spines?
Well, I'm calling for CEOs to be active in a sense, because nobody else has the weight or the power or the influence to do those things. The Republican Party is now a creature of Trump. The Democratic Party is a waste of space and time. The courts are being bullied. We still have to see whether the Supreme Court will roll over to Trump, but they're being bullied. The American system depends on constraints on the power of the leader, and most of those constraints are being weakened. The business community is a group of people who can stand up to him. Whether they will do is a very difficult question to answer. I think that they're frightened of him, that they don't want to be investigated for monopoly or whatever he might investigate them for. The tech people have been particularly feeble about this, but they do have duties to their shareholders. The conduct of American policy at the moment is destroying value. The stock market's gone down 10%. I mean, since Trump's come in, it's gone down a lot. These are global companies that are very concerned by tariffs being taken on and put on and moving all over the place. I saw there was a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal that said a bunch of business people had got together and they said, look, if the market goes down 10%, we won't discover our backbone, but if it does go down 20%, then we will. So which is a sort of quite nice business approach. I think if the market correction continues, in the way that it's continuing now. They are very, very nervous about what's going on. And there will come a point when, they will get nervous. Will Trump respond to that? I think Trump regards when he's looking at the metrics about how good a job he's doing, how high the stock market is certainly an important metric for him. And I think he's, although he's a narcissist and the rest of it, he does look for feedback about what he's doing. And one of the feedback mechanisms he has is Fox News and the conservative sort of news. And once you have Fox News reflecting discontent amongst conservative Republican voters about the plunging value of their 401ks, their retirement pensions, then he might look at that and think, wait a minute, I'm worried about this. He's not an ideologue. He's a narcissist. He's a person who's in the grip of a certain set of mercantilist ideas about economists, but he's not an ideologue. There are people around him who are ideologues, many of them who are quite anti-capitalist. But I think he would, the feedback from CEOs questioning seriously what he's doing, from the stock market going down, and from people on Fox Business saying, I can't run my business like this, would cause him to change direction.
What are the other levers in America that could influence Mr. Trump? Clearly voters. Are the states, and governors going to be a possible source of influence?
I don't think so. I think that he has got the Republican Party under his control. And in the past, whenever Republicans have resisted what he's said, he's crushed them and they've come back into line. Rubio, the Secretary of State, is a classic example of that, who's changed his politics almost entirely. The Supreme Court is a very possible constraint on his power. And although people will say, well, 6 members were appointed by Republicans and by Trump, many of them by Trump himself, and they're Republicans. They're also institutionalists. They're also people who have a certain reading of the law. And so I think if they came up with a ruling about the constraints of his power, and he tried to override the Supreme Court, well, that would be a major, major thing. I mean, that would be a big threat to the liberal order, democracy in the United States. I don't think he'd do that. And we have to remember the last time he had one of the really powerful presidents was FDR, Roosevelt, and he tried to shift the court by packing the court, by shifting the composition of the court. And, in that struggle in the late 1930s, the court prevailed, despite the fact that Roosevelt had won a much bigger majority than Trump ever did. So that would be an interesting test of power. And I think that would be the ultimate test for him. But he is a populist. He sees the people as being the real people, as being the people who he has to be answerable to. And if the real people, in the form of people who watch Fox News and the rest of it, start turning against him because they're getting poorer, then I think he would adjust his course. I think he would adjust his course if the Supreme Court came out with a real solid judgment against him. But Congress, no. The governor
back to business. Yeah, that's very interesting. To come back to business, which obviously is not, there are many interests, different interests in the business sector, and they would only come together, or a sufficient number to prevail, to somehow stand up if it was so chaotic. It's the instability of the system which would cut across many different interests in business to bring them together. So that could be a possible,
Absolutely. And what you're getting at the moment is the tech people are cowed, and so they're bowing the knee. And also, to a significant extent, if you operate in cyberspace, you don't care that much about a lot of these tariffs and things like that. The car industry is very worried. And they've basically said, both Ford and General Motors have said, we cannot make any investments in these environments. We're just not going to make any more investments. We're just going to sit on our capital. And if you're Trump and what you're trying to do is bring supply chains back home, And if you're really focused on the manufacturing sector, which is what he claims to be focused on, that's worrying, because they're not building factories anywhere, let alone at home. So that sort of instability is much more of a concern for the sort of sectors that he actually wants to promote manufacturing than it is for the people he basically doesn't like, which is the tech people.
Yeah. Although he's so close to them.
He's close to Musk, and they bowed down to him, but he doesn't trust them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me indulge for a few more minutes and come back to a very big issue that you raised earlier, which is about migration to Europe, into Europe and the UK in particular. I know you think this is a very important issue now with long-term consequences. So talk to us a little bit about this, and perhaps you did talk a bit about Sweden. Anything else you want to add on how they're dealing with this or starting to deal with it?
There's no country, there's no issue in Europe, really, with the possible exception of the military issue, defending ourselves from the Russians, that is so central to our policy, our politics, than migration. That there was a time when the sort of liberal consensus prevailed on migration. And the argument was that from economic liberals was that migration was good because it expanded the economy and boosted overall living standards. And social liberals said that it's a great thing because it creates a more diverse, vibrant country or community. Both of those arguments are now very, very widely questioned, partly because immigration is not boosting productivity, maybe boosting overall economic output, but it's not boosting productivity. And we've got very high levels of unemployment amongst certain groups of immigrants. So it's very hard to claim that we need to import lots of people when a significant number of those people become unemployed in the long term. And in terms of the social impact of immigration, whatever its impact on creating vibrancy and the rest of it, we've also had a lot of problems, particularly in Muslim communities, of integration. And there've been a large number of terrorist incidents. There've been large numbers of assimilation problems, particularly to do with expressions of faith and things like that, that mean that Europe has basically changed its collective mind on immigration. And it's basically said, we don't want significantly more of this. We want to limit it, stop it, or even reverse it. That has changed the politics of Germany, absolutely, fundamentally. So the Alternative for Deutschland won 21% of the votes in the last election. This is a really very hardline right-wing party, which won that vote and got large numbers of Germans to vote for it, simply because, even though I think a lot of them were disquieted by some of its more unsavory connections, because they wanted to send a very clear signal about immigration. They don't want any more of it. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is basically really clamping down on immigration at the moment, and saying, you know, that's basically it. Even in Canada, which, you know, was in many ways the most liberal, left liberal of all the governments in the rich world, have basically said we've got to move from taking more people to assimilating the people we've taken. In Portugal and Spain, they're putting an enormous emphasis on fit, on cultural fit. So they're taking people from South America, but not from so many from other countries. So all of these things, and the country that everybody's looking to at the moment about immigration is Denmark. Denmark was the country that was most restrictive in immigration, and it was the country that put most emphasis on assimilation. Said, if you're going to come to this country, you have to essentially become a Dane. You can't just preserve your traditional way of doing things. You have to become a Dane. I don't think there's any party now in Europe that can A, win elections, and B, have a traditional liberal open attitude to immigration. That's just finished. So that has big implications for, well, it has big implications for the economy of Europe, because, you know, we're in a demographic decline, and we're going to have to extend working lives and things like that to fill the jobs that are not going to be done by immigrants. But it also has massive implications for Africa, which is the only continent in the world now which I think is significantly increasing its population, and producing migrants. And those migrants are going to find it very, very hard to come to Europe, increasingly hard. And if we have the next election, the next big significant election is Marine Le Pen in France, and it's significantly possible that she will win. And if she wins, that is a massive, massive signal to move yet further to the right in Europe. She's come closer and closer and closer to winning. They've hitherto been able to sort of gang up against her and keep her out. But that, and the AfD has come from nothing to 21%. Well, if it gets 26% next time, which next time is some time away, but it's all of these parties creeping up. And in Britain, we have this party called Reform, which has come from nothing to being the party that is consistently ahead of the polls. It could replace the Conservatives or form an alliance with the Conservatives to be the party of the right. And its single biggest issue is migration. So whole of European politics is being turned on its head. And of course, we have Trump, who won very significantly on the migration issue and is now adopting incredibly hardline policies on migration. He has now started to deport people.
Sure. This is a very big issue. Lots of questions about skilled migrants, unskilled migrants, and assimilation.
I think there will be a very strong bias towards skilled migrants. And you will be able to get in as a skilled migrant, but it'll be a lot of hoops and it'll be quite difficult. And as I say, even so, now in the latest figures from Denmark, the proportion of people who are ethnically Danish in the population of people aged 20 to 25 is higher than amongst other groups. So the population is becoming once again, more ethnically homogenous, that people are leaving or not arriving. Sweden now has a policy of repatriating people, paying them to leave the country, regardless of their skill levels. So we're moving in the opposite direction. We're moving in the direction of getting people out rather than letting them in, which is, massively different from what it was. In 2010, when the Tories came in Britain, they were basically saying, send me your poor, send me your hungry, and this is what we need to have a growing economy.
And in the context of a Europe with a population not reproducing itself.
Absolutely. So is it sustainable? You have this population sending very strong signals at the moment that it's full. It may start say, well, wait a minute, I need people in my care homes, or I need some other way. And definitely the way forward, is not to cut off migration, particularly skilled migration, entirely. But we do need, I think, wherever you stand politically, that assimilation has not gone anywhere near as well as it should have done.
Yeah. Well, Adrian, thank you very much. I'm sorry to have rushed you through so many absolutely vital topics.
I'm a journalist. We skip over the surface of many things. That's our job.
Well, hopefully people will go on to read some of your articles in Bloomberg, but also your books. Thank you so much for being with us. And
thank you.
We'll close now.
Very enjoyable.
That was really terrific. Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.